Merry Christmas, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa and the world's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. In this show, we gather a panel of brilliant South Africans who live scattered around the world to discuss the most important South African and global news stories and ideas of the week. What a show we have ahead of us today. We are doing a review of what our panelists think are the most important stories of 2025 in South Africa, the US, and the UK. But before we get to all of that, let me introduce you to our panel of brilliant South Africans from across the globe. Joining us from Germany, where he is collating a list of good and bad boys and girls, the director of the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the Weihnachtsmann of Woltemershausen, James Myberg. From Germany, we are off to the United Kingdom, where we find our UK correspondent berating the speed of the elves in his factory. He is the Father Christmas of Fitzrovia, Simon Lincoln Reeder. And from the UK, we go to the US as we are joined by the director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, who is hitching his reindeer to his sleigh, the Santa Claus of the Smithsonian, Richard Tren. And we are finally off to South Africa, where we are joined by the Common Sense's editor, who is getting ready to travel around the world in a single evening. He is the founder of Frans Private Clients, die Kersvader van Kyalami, Frans Cranier. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, I am your host, lighting up the night with my glowing red nose, the Rudolph of Rondebosch, Gabriel Makin. So, gentlemen, I think that we will start our review of this year at home in South Africa. So, Frans, maybe let's start with you as to what you think the most important stories in South Africa were from 2025.
Yeah, I think it's one thing for me, and that's the language with which people talk about South Africa's government. And it's a language that talks about who the partners will be. And even in the ANC, that's become the language. Who will we partner with? And that I think is a really significant thing because it means that for the time being, and this can change again, of course, but for the time being, South Africa is becoming a country that will be governed by more than one political party. And that in the language that's being used, whether in the press or in business or by diplomats or by the ANC itself, that recognition stands out very strongly. And we've made the point on the show before that if you think back to the territory that is South Africa today, and let's go way back over the last several hundred years, wherever you were in that territory, the chances were very good that there'd be one single political actor that would be calling the shots and would be running the part of the country that you were in. And that has changed and changed in May last year is obviously very important. And that reality seems to be sinking in and to being broadly accepted. And for me, that was the most important single development around South Africa in 2025.
Yeah, Frans, on that, I think it's quite interesting because when you and I had our first discussion years back before I started working for you, we recorded a podcast together. And one of the points that I raised to you in that podcast was that I see the potential of South Africa to become the political system to become something like the Netherlands, which is very used to this coalition style of governance in which no party commands a majority of the vote, and every party therefore has to be used to working together. And one of the things that I think has been interesting, given that kind of the context of that discussion, is in that discussion we said we needed the informal institutions to develop around the system, where the political parties in South Africa need to start getting used to how to govern together. And if they develop the informal channels that allow the kind of co-governance to happen, we might end up in a reality in which not only is co-governance accepted, but it's a kind of smooth and it allows for multiple parts of South African society to be represented at the same time. And do you kind of see the development of the GNU heading in this direction?
Well, I think at the moment, I mean, it can, of course, all change again. There's a good example out of just a couple of days ago on at the beginning of well, a few days ago, in Natal, the MK party called a vote of no confidence in the premier of that province, and the premier was of the IFP and was in government with the DA and the ANC. And what happened is, well, that motion of no confidence was defeated, and the ANC and the IFP and the DA actually stood together. And again, the ANC had an open goal here. If it wished for the alternative, it really wished to govern with MK and the EFF. There it was. Could have done it. And this broad coalition stood together. I mean, one way of looking at it is the DA saved the ANC in the sense of still giving it a foothold in Natal. Had this vote gone through, perhaps the other way around, the ANC could have been in even deeper trouble in Natal. And as we've argued before, if you're the ANC and you lose your what grip you have left on Natal and Gauteng, which seems like it might happen given how badly the ANC is polling in that province, all that's left is the kind of rural Northwest, Limpopo and Mpumalanga and bits of the Eastern Cape. And in fact, the ANC's elections head in the last few days made exactly this point, that if the party loses more ground in Gauteng and KZN by extension, it will become a rural party, and that will be the end of it. And so here you had the sort of amazing lineup of the IFP, the DA, and the ANC actually under pressure, standing together to hold up at least the Natal version of the GNU. That I remember that conversation we had a couple of years ago, and I think the thing we said at the time, we were recording one of your early podcasts. I think that's what we were doing. Yeah. You were just getting going. Now you're much more established. And the point we were making was that South Africa is a very diverse society. And once the apartheid era had washed out and the first kind of post-apartheid political generations had washed out, and South Africans had got over the consequences of both, and normal kind of mundane material living standards issues began to manifest, something that you might see as the politics break up to start to reflect to some extent that diversity. And I think in the GNU there's an element of that. Certainly the ANC's kind of got parts of the aspirant middle class, and the DA's got the established middle class, and then you get the sort of the IFPs and so on in Natal with what they've got. But yeah, and the striking thing again for me is just, if you go and listen, you must listen very carefully. If you listen to how people speak and what they say and what even the ANC says, the sort of ANC language is have we picked the right partner to govern South Africa with? That's a very different way to think than we govern South Africa. Why do we need a partner? And the language is now so dominant that it is almost enough to say that party appears in itself to have given up. I think it's wrong to give up. I think it can still get to 50 one day. But appears to in itself chiefly have given up on the prospect of ever seeing its numbers rise to above 50% again. And that, if you think back, over the full history here, that is a very, very amazing thing, a significant thing to have happened.
Yeah, I think in terms of Christmas miracles, we might be looking at one, but we're going to stay in South Africa and move to you, James, as our resident historian in chief of South Africa. What are your most important stories coming out of SA this year?
I think there's a famous quote by Jan Smuts where he says, "South Africa is a country where the best, like the worst, never happens." And I think this was another year in which that could be seen to apply. I mean, it sort of started out with the ANC sort of putting its foot down on the sort of realizing sort of its revolutionary goals in the form of the National Democratic Revolution. by signing the Expropriation Act into law, which was it's in the long run, a medium to long term, it's a very dangerous act in that it allows government to target property and then pay or offer below market value compensation for it. And then, of course, you had the counter reaction coming from, of all places, the White House, with Donald Trump then, issuing first a tweet and then the executive order pushing back against that. And then you, so it's sort of going between the two. You then later on had the, government issuing regulations around the Employment Equity Act, which intended to reduce, I suppose, white males to 4% of employment across the entire economy. So there you have the sort of revolution charging ahead. You have the Constitutional Court refusing to hear the appeal on the Kill the Boer case, which essentially legitimates that chant. But then on the other side, you have the DA finally sort of getting its act together, and with the case of the ANC's effort to hike VAT, pushing back, choosing that as a great issue to stand their ground on, and eventually winning. And I think in that way, sort of showing that they're not pushovers within the GNU, which was very important to show that to the ANC. Otherwise, the ANC would have just carried on sort of relentlessly. I suppose Trump also acted as in his sort of crazy way, acted as a deterrent. I suppose you have Israel's sort of essentially defeat of Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah, sort of essentially taking that issue out of the South African debate. So that probably helped as well. And so, and then of course the other, I think, critical thing was the Mkonazi's press conference in July this year, where he took on the government for closing down the KwaZulu-Natal political task team for allegedly investigating criminal political networks in Gauteng that the cages wanted protected. And I think that's been very important, not for just showing the for what it's exposed now, but it points a long way back. I mean, that dynamic whereby very well connected criminals essentially have lent on their political patrons to shut down investigations or shut down investigative units. I mean, that goes back to the early 2000s in South Africa. So it exposed a part of how the ANC has historically operated for the first time, I think, and that I think that's been very important. So by the end of the year, you have sort of the GNU actually sort of beginning to function. I think the ANC beginning to be quite glad that there were sort of economic green shoots, as it likes calling them. And then you have, as Frans says, this narrow escape in KZN, where the government of provincial unity sort of held firm, very narrowly. So you have the year ending on a sort of a fairly positive note. In that regard. So that's how I would read the year.
And what do you make of France's comment about the new dynamics that the ANC seem to be getting used to the GNU? Do you think it's a kind of combination of the pushback on the National Democratic Revolution stuff and then the hard realities, the global hard realities that hit them this year in terms of Trump, the defeat of Iran's axis in the Middle East, the things you pointed out here?
Well, I think it is partly that if they go into coalition with MK and EFF, it's going to be very painful for them. So the DA is a sort of comfortable alternative, which leaves their options open, going forward. I think it has helped that there's been pressure on the ANC to sort of compromise. Otherwise, they would, in terms of their balance of forces analysis, be obliged to, to charge forward. But they haven't taken any of that stuff off the table. I mean, the Expropriation Act is although it's been challenged in court, so maybe that'll be a means to correct it, hopefully. And the employment equity stuff is still on the table. I see the NHI is going to, they want to push ahead with the NHI. So all futures, as Rian Malan once said, are possible in South Africa, and all the futures are still, open. So it's at the moment things look quite relatively positive, but as Frans says, that can always change. It can change with one person shifting their vote in KZN, in which case the MK suddenly gets access to a huge patronage well, which it can then use to build itself out. At the moment, I think it's limited because it doesn't have the access to that much patronage. But one vote shifts, that changes, the whole dynamic can shift.
Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to anybody, South Africa hosted the G20, and how do you think South Africa comes out with this? Does it seems like South Africa's always wanted to punch above its weight on the international arena, given the history of the country. Does South Africa come out looking more like a leader, or more like an irrelevance at the tip of Africa? How do you see that playing out?
Frans, do you want to answer that?
No, I think the G20 was always going to be a kind of mirror to the country, and in and of itself, it reflects what you are, and I think it did that fairly well on SA this year. I mean, the event itself was well enough run. At times, it looked quite professional. We had the sort of fighter jets, both of them flying back and forth over the city. You could have thought there was an entire squadron, and those great helicopter gunships that South Africa has but could never sell. They were flying around. If you sort of were playing golf at the time, you'd see them all over. And the place had been spruced up a bit, and the highways looked better and all of that. So it was fine. I mean, but then there was something quite revealing. When the Americans said they wouldn't come, and afterwards they said they won't invite the South Africans to G20 in Florida next year, the South African government released a statement defending itself, and it said, well, so many of the delegates who had come to the G20 had said what a very nice time they'd had, and had said how much they'd enjoyed themselves, and how sort of nice the chauffeurs had been. And that gave me a little thought about what was that all about? Why aren't they saying your economy is booming and your global influence is so significant and all of that? And I think to this extent there were diplomats looking for something nice to say. On the broader positioning of South Africa in the world, I think the two significant things that stood out is they weren't at Sharm el-Sheikh for the signing of the Gaza peace treaty, and that because they weren't welcome, and they weren't at the peace in the DRC that was done recently by the Americans, and I think that was telling.
Simon?
I just wanted to mention in the spirit of generosity and good tidings that I think that the South African government should be congratulated for the ratings upgrade. I know it's not a major thing, but you should give credit where it's due. And that midterm budget was something that was very pleasing, and was the first that we've heard, and we've lived through a decade in which at the beginning of it was the appointment of Des van Rooyen as a weekend special finance minister, and to have gone through that process to reach a point where the proverbial and cliched, sorry, but green shoots appeared as they did. I think it's a huge vote of congratulations to all that were involved in getting us off the grey list, the financial task action, and subsequently the vote of confidence in the ratings.
Yeah, I think that those are two very important things. And then to add my own two things to the South African story of this year, as a pollster, I think my most significant development was the announcement by Helen Zille that she will be running for Johannesburg, and what that could potentially portend for the dynamics on the local government level, and what it means potentially for South Africa's metros looking forward to the next local government elections, either at the end of next year or the beginning of the year afterwards. And then the other thing that happened this year, it was incredibly significant, is that the DA has managed to poll over 30% across multiple different polls across the year. And this indicates that it seems as though the South Africa is moving into a new political dispensation, all things being equal, that in which the two parties will be fighting, the ANC assaulting it from down and the DA assaulting it coming up. They will be fighting for the 30% position. And we might have moved into, without even really realizing it, a new South African political system in which there is possibility of change between which party is the biggest in the country. And I think on those two developments alone, there's a lot that could that a lot of the future of South African governance hinges on those two things. And so I think to wrap up our conversation on South Africa, maybe briefly I can go to each of you to kind of give a sense of whether you think that you're going, one should go long on South Africa, short on South Africa, or just get rid of the whole thing. So, Frans, let's start with you.
Look, I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve, and what your position is, and what your risk appetite is, and your investment strategy. So it depends on a lot of things. But South Africa is very cheaply priced at the moment in a very expensive world. I mean, literally, its stock market is quite cheap. Currency is quite cheap. Buying property in South Africa is cheap. If you live in the country, it might not be the case, but I mean in a more global sense. And there are countervailing forces in favor of its success. It's a democracy. The democracy is working, as we saw in Natal this week. That's a very significant positive in post-colonial Africa. Public opinion is pragmatic, centrist, and conservative. It's not radicalized. That's another significant positive. Fiscal prudence is being maintained to a significant extent. Don't take such things for granted at all. And we've listed the things on the show before. And therefore, if you do take a long-term, sort of 5, 10, 15, 20-year view on a place, you can certainly justify the argument that it is worth buying into South Africa now progressively over time, but you could realize a significant upside. The other side of that, which again, it depends on who you are, is that on South Africa, you should be very well hedged, because there's no certainty of where it will go. I mean, James has made the point that, yeah, the year ended better than it started, but a lot of the dangerous stuff is still on the table. And the way I sometimes put it, if we talk at a wealth seminar or something of that nature, is I say to a chap, if you ask this question about committing to SA, let's flip it around a bit. Let's say you're an American, and let's say you've come into an inheritance and you've inherited $1 million. And this comes as a bit of a surprise, and you go and see your investment manager and you say to them, what should we do with $1 million? If that chap said to you, I've got a great idea, we're going to invest it all in South Africa. It's a small little economy, about 0.4% of global GDP on the southern tip of Africa. the economic growth rate of 1%, 30% unemployment, some really volatile politics. This is what but it's a bargain basement buy, which to an extent is true. This is what I do. You'd say to the chap, you're crazy. What sort of advice is this? And it doesn't mean that if you're a South African, the advice needs to be any different. You do need to be well hedged, and that's not because there's something unique on South Africa. South Africa's become a volatile emerging market, like many other volatile emerging markets. So I think you can go long on the country, definitely. You can make a very firm case to do that. Particularly if you understand the enclave phenomena too, that we've spoken about through the year on the show, that it's not just a question of whether macro SA does really well, governed out of Pretoria. But even if that doesn't happen, the country is balkanizing into enclaves, and the collective of those enclaves will represent some of the world's most exciting emerging markets. So by all means, go long on the country. Yes, I would advise that. But at the same time, be well hedged, because it is a volatile emerging market.
Simon?
One thing I noticed about the end of the G20 was that where was the positive sentiment in its majority, where it was coming from? I don't think it was coming from the Australians or the Indonesians or the Latin Americans or the guys in the Middle East. I think that the majority of it came from from Europeans, right? Now, why is that? That Europe is changing and not necessarily for the better. And I think that South Africa will, my prediction is that it will enjoy a renewed level of interest. And my only comment to the South Africans would be to bargain for a better deal than the one you got last time. So then we won't have a problem like the arms deal again. But I would say I'd agree with Frans, their hedge. But it is generally encouraging, and I base that also on the sentiment in the UK news media. Not that you can trust many of them, but the editorial lines have shifted, and I think in hindsight, one will look at the Financial Times and the Economist and their two respective articles on BEE within this year as being interesting points to chart the journey on. That's it. Thanks.
Frans, back to you.
Yeah, I want to say a few things. One is that in the end, if you're trying to read these questions on sentiment, there's one number that you can rely on, and that's the fixed investment rate. That's fixed investment committed to the economy as a share of its size. And South Africa's number sits at around 15%, and the emerging market average is closer to 30%. So it's half of what it should be. And I should have added that to my comments about the Europeans saying how nice the people were when they got here, because they really, I felt they felt there wasn't much more that they could say, and that's an extremely important number, and that's the one that tells you how the Europeans and others outside, Chinese, Russians, can be whoever you want. They could all lift the fixed investment number. That's the number that tells you what they really think about that. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Another thing I wanted to say is just been raised now. It should have been on my list when we discussed the show. The significant events in the year. There was a researcher a research professor at Wits University made the point during the year that R1 trillion had been split between, I think, 100 BEE beneficiaries. That was a very devastating number for the whole idea of BEE. Then, related to that, a few months thereafter, a chap by the name of Matt Cuthbert did what I had dinner with him that evening. Did, I think, one of the most significant things that's happened in the country. And he held a press conference. He's the DA's policy director. And he announced that the DA would be pursuing an alternative to BEE. And at dinner, I said to him, well, how did it go during the press conference? Did they throw things at you or walk out, shout at you that you were a terrible person? And he said, no. He said the press asked, well, this alternative, how would it work? And what would it be? And I said to him, and he's a bit younger than some of us on this call, although not all. And I said to him, dude, you don't realize how significant it is that you held a press conference and said we're going to challenge the foundational policy that the ANC had built its reign in South Africa around. and that the press asked you, well, how would your alternative work? I said to him, that is a very significant moment for the country. So I'd add that to the list of events through the years. And I'd actually say to you, I think it's quite related to what I said. My big point was about how even the ANC talks about its future. It talks about it as if it has given up on its dominance. And when Matt held that press conference, Mr. Ramaphosa responded and said, the right place to discuss this is in Parliament. And I thought that was extraordinary too, because many of Mr. Ramaphosa's predecessors would have said it's absurd. I mean, of course, we're not reversing the policy or adjusting it or anything. He said we discuss it in Parliament, and then later in the year, the relevant minister, I think it's a DTI minister. I didn't research this for the show, so I think it's that. He announced that the government would undertake a substantive review of BEE policy in the country. And that chain of events, from that Wits academics numbers that were so widely reported, to Matt's press conference, to the Ramaphosa saying, let's do this in Parliament, to the then announcement of the review in Parliament. That was a major change in the sort of, if you use Star Wars analogies, which are always quite good for this sort of thing, a change in the balance of the force.
Yes, and so I think we can end our discussion on South Africa on that note. Oh, no, Frans wants one more thing.
I'm sorry, I'm saying a lot. I just want to ask James a question. That he said it last week, and he said it again today, and he probably said it the week before, about how the ANC sort of set off on quite a revolutionary pace early in the year, and then Trump came into play. And James's point appears to be that Trump kind of set the ANC back somewhat. How important, James, do you think Donald Trump has been this year to what happened in South Africa?
I have a feeling that it gave the ANC pause for the first time. And the way Trump phrases things is often regrettable. But it really was, I think, the first time that a Western leader actually said you mustn't do this sort of thing. And what Western leaders were doing previously was in the case of the Europeans, who actually have a terrible history in post-apartheid South Africa, they were agreeing to very, very dubious weapons deals and that sort of thing. So if you look beyond the sort of hyperbole and the misphrasing and whatever, I think it was a hugely significant event. I think it came as a huge shock to the ANC that this happened. They're far more used to, these European leaders praising them in public and then trying to cut very crooked deals in private. So this came as a shock, and I think it did give pause, and it probably, then suddenly the DA becomes a useful alibi, that you're not committing white genocide. So you parade them at the White House as your sort of exhibit number one. But I do have the sense that it had an impact, and my worry is that when that passes, because Trump will lose interest, or a different president comes in, then what is going to happen then?
Richard?
Yeah, I was at an event on Friday at the Hudson Institute, and Walter Russell Mead, who's an important thinker on global matters, made the point that for the first time in a long time, Trump is the one who's in the Hans Christian Andersen fable saying the emperor has no clothes on a range of issues. Now, sometimes he's the emperor, but in some cases, and I think like with South Africa, he's the one pointing out the bleeding obvious and doing things, breaking the mold from the way, in the way that the establishment advisors would have suggested he tread forward cautiously and whether that comes, whether that relates to bombing Iran or dealing with the Europeans, or calling it as he sees it with South Africa. So, it's kind of refreshing. I think sometimes Trump is exactly right, and he says it in a clumsy way, but he's pointing out the emperor has no clothes. And I think when it comes to property rights, he did South Africans a favor, not the ANC, South Africans.
Yes, and I think that staying on the theme of Donald Trump, obviously 2025 has been his first year as in his second term as US president. And we are very lucky that we have you, Richard, with us, because you've been guiding us through some of the big developments coming out of the US these last few months. But we'll turn our attention now to the United States and to Trump's first year as you take us through what you think are the most important stories of from coming out of the United States from this year.
Yeah, well, this is, to use a cliche, like it's been like drinking from a fire hose this year. I think I made the point a while ago that I was sorry that I was going to be away during the midterms this November until I realized that, in fact, the midterms are next year. It feels like we've had a whole year, 2 years in one. In fact, sometimes it feels like 10 years. So it's nonstop here. Every moment you wake up, or every day you wake up, every 10 minutes you look at your feed and there's something new that's come down the pike. I think we can look at some of the stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And, every day we're getting some good stories and we're getting some bad stories and we're getting some very worrying things arising that I think we should be very, well, at least I'm anxious about. And I think all Americans should be cautious about. Look, let's deal with the good. One of the first things that Trump did was clamp down on border crossings, illegal border crossings. Millions of people were allowed and encouraged under the Biden administration to cross the border illegally. It created huge societal criminal problems here. It was it was almost as if the Biden administration was working for drug dealers and human traffickers. He stopped that immediately. We were told by the Democrats that it was impossible to do, that we needed legislation. Nonsense. You just needed the political will to do it. That's all very good. We saw very early on very positive policies on energy exploration, a commitment to exploiting fossil fuels here, and movement on other issues like on nuclear, and a recognition that if that energy is the foundation of any modern economy. If the United States wants to embrace the future of AI, be an AI leader, it needs energy. And so we see this very good, positive energy policy coming out of the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Interior, all working together very well. And at the same time, we've seen positive developments on sort of climate activism. I think we should not underestimate the importance of Bill Gates finally waking up to the arguments that people like Bjorn Lomborg have been making for many, many years, that you can take climate change seriously, but this is not an emergency. And I think this is an important global story, and I see the US leading on this. Early on, we saw moves from this administration to move away from woke identity politics and away from identitarianism and back to a merit-based system. This country is based on individualism and on individual merit, and I think we're getting back to that. We're seeing a return, a move against affirmative action. We already had legal victories against affirmative action in college and university admissions, and now this is more broad. And this is popular across all races. Why? Because we're individuals, and nobody wants to be identified by their race, but to be seen as an individual, and unless you're on the sort of the far left, far woke. But this is the decisions on affirmative action here are popular amongst Black Americans. in very large part because they have been failed by affirmative action policies. We now have fewer Black engineers, lawyers, doctors because of these policies. It has betrayed Black Americans, and at the same time, you're seeing very positive education reforms. The Trump administration has vowed to close down the Department of Education, the federal Department of Education, and return education policy and education freedom to the states and local areas. And I think that's very good, and because it undermines the very radical teachers' unions that have had a stranglehold on education to the detriment of poor Americans and to minority Americans, most importantly. So these are all good and positive things to celebrate. I'm sure there are others that I'm getting wrong, and I say this, that I'm sure I'm missing things out. The bad, why is it that we have to keep relearning lessons? Human beings are trading animals. We have been trading since the earliest recorded history. And yet now we're back to a position now where we have an administration that seems to think trade is bad. We're imposing tariffs. This has been very bad for our economy. We are not seeing Donald Trump vowed to have a restoration, a resurgence in manufacturing, forgetting, of course, that we are still a huge manufacturing economy. We just don't produce the same things that we did 50 years ago. Yet we look back with this nostalgia of the 1950s, ridiculously, as the United States is producing lots of steel and stuff like that. So he's imposed these tariffs. We're seeing manufacturing shrinking. We're not seeing a boom in employment. Economic growth has been pretty robust, driven mostly by AI, not in manufacturing and not in broad-based employment. And it's one of the reasons that Trump's approval ratings are low. And it's one of the reasons that in the November, these quirky off-cycle elections in November, the Republicans were hammered and the Democrats are riding high because Donald Trump is not delivering. He was reelected because people remember how much wealthier they were, how the economy grew in the first term. And why did it grow in the first term? It's because he let the economy flourish. He removed barriers to growth. In his first year, he's been imposing barriers to growth. Yes, we've been having some good regulatory reform and energy policies, but these tariff policies and his vow to drain the swamp, it's only getting swampier. We're seeing a huge increase in swamp-like behavior in DC because every time he imposes a tariff, he gets lobbied by some or other industry for a special carve-out. This is all bad. And this move towards industrial policy where we think Donald Trump and his economic advisors are smarter than the millions and millions of people making investments decisions and consumption decisions every day, that we think they in the White House have a better idea how to run the economy. It's absurd. We have to keep relearning these lessons, unfortunately. Bad, again, we saw Doge, we saw led by Elon Musk. It was good in that it exposed a lot of the waste and the extraordinary stories of fraud that are coming up, but it didn't really do much to rein in government because the Trump administration refuses to deal with entitlements. 70% of our spending, and we're heading towards, will be at $40 trillion in debt soon. These numbers are so astronomical, it's hard to wrap your head around. It's like thinking about space. And yet they will not address entitlement spending. And that is what will, this is like this huge iceberg out there, and we're just speeding up towards it. So, and Doge did nothing about that. I'm sure there are other, like I said, there are going to be other things that come up. But let's deal with a few of the ugly things. The closing of the border and stopping illegal immigration was very popular. Arresting violent criminal gang members that came in illegally, very popular. But now we've seen this, and I've seen this a few blocks from my house, where you have masked immigration officials stopping guys in white vans going to paint houses, plumbers, electricians, and arresting them and detaining them and deporting them. This is very unpopular. Um, I'm not someone who throws the word fascist around. This is not fascist behavior, but this is thuggish behavior. And it smacks of a contempt for the rule of law. We're supposed to be a country that prizes the rule of law and due process. And these roundups of people at the Home Depot, otherwise good people who this is it. There's an ugliness to this that I think should have us worried. We're seeing the Trump administration using lawfare in the same way that the Democrats went after them, targeting people like James Comey, the former head of the FBI, Letitia James, the district attorney from New York who targeted Trump. I understand the instinct. Revenge is a powerful human instinct. But this takes us further down a dangerous path of using law against political enemies. And for one thing, Trump's not even doing it particularly well. I mean, these cases keep on being thrown out because I'm afraid this White House is kind of incompetent when it comes to its revenge. But this is not good. It would have been far better if Trump had pointed out how damaging the Democratic Party's lawfare against him had been, and then drawing a line under it and saying no more. But I think he's not done that, and I can foresee, especially if, as we expect, the Republicans lose the House of Representatives in the midterms next year, more attempts at using there'll be indictments brought by the House against Trump, and more of this kind of lawfare. I don't like it. For the entire Biden administration, we heard correctly how corrupt the Biden family had been. This wretched Hunter Biden with his unsavory business dealings with Russians, with Ukrainians, with God knows who, and this pathetic art career that he suddenly conjured up, and this was rightly criticized as corrupt. Well, now we're seeing the Trump children almost saying, "Hold my beer. Let me show you how it's done," with their businesses in crypto and other areas. This is unseemly. It's gross, and this is a further kind of debasement of our politics, and I don't like it. These things are ugly. Those are my quick good, bad, and ugly. Oh, one quick bad, which verges into ugly, is we saw the new mayor-elect. He'll soon be the mayor of New York in the White House, having a very pleasant meeting with Donald Trump. He's a socialist. He's a hideous individual, I think, a Jew hater of note. But they got on famously well, partly, I think, because as a socialist, Mamdani wants to seize the means of production. Well, what's the Trump administration doing? It's taking shares in Intel. It keeps on taking shares in major US companies. It's taking cuts of this sale of chips. This is taking us further down to a more statist world, and I don't like it. That's another bad.
So, Frans, I think you had a couple of things that you wanted to add to the American story. So should we go to you?
Yeah, well, and the global story. I think the biggest thing of the year was Gates saying that, yeah, you can climate change, you can think of it as a problem, but it's not an emergency, and it will not be the end of the world. And that was very important because the idea of climate change, the threat of it, the hysteria created around it, had been the premier tool through which to argue against economic freedom and capitalism. To say that, no, you can't have more energy, you shouldn't have more investment, growth isn't a good thing in its own right. the damage to the planet is simply too big. And when Gates, who'd played such a central role in establishing all that kind of nonsense in the minds of people, retracted and said it wasn't true, he took a lot of the momentum out of the broader climate lobby. And as a consequence of that, the credibility of arguments that say, no, you shouldn't have more industry, you shouldn't build more factories, you shouldn't have more mining, you shouldn't have everything that goes with that. The strength of those arguments has diminished. And this is incredibly good for the Western world. And I say the Western world deliberately, because the non-Western world hadn't fallen for any of this to begin with. If you draw a chart of let's say India's or China's or Russia's carbon emissions, the line continues to rise over the past 20 or 30 years. It passed every COP conference that many of these countries attended and signed on to. It was really only some Western democracies that bought into this with sufficient sincerity to undermine the standing and competitiveness of their economies. And that was very dangerous, because it meant that the Western world, the free world, the democratic world, was becoming relatively less competitive compared to the non-free world. And I'm pretty certain, and I'm not alone in the view, and people much better placed than me when I raise it with them say, you should believe it. We're ever more of the view that this kind of climate stuff was being used by the adversaries of the Western liberal order to try and weaken it and to undermine it. And the consequences of that were very bad. The rise of let's say, the hard right in Europe, as opposed to the sort of sensible conservative center, was to some extent a consequence of very high energy prices. So the line I would draw for you is that for 20 years, the climate hysteria had served perhaps as the primary vehicle through which to launch assaults against long-term sustainability of the Western liberal order. And when Gates rescinded his position, he diluted those arguments sufficiently that it gave a real shot in the arm. I don't know if that was his intention or not, to the longer-term competitiveness of Western liberal societies. And for that reason, for me, that was the most important development of 2025 anywhere in the world.
James?
I just wanted to ask, on the subject of being cautious of, greens bearing gifts. To what degree, though, is that still being pushed on South Africa by the Europeans, and all the money that's being promised? Is that essentially to continue with those sort of destructive policies within South Africa?
Yeah. It's still here, very much so. The government still buys into it. I've actually been struck in recent weeks by reading some kind of advertorials by sort of corporate institutions and others about the sort of dire state of things and the need to greenify everything. And you must remember, if you're listening to this and you haven't perhaps followed us in detail over the couple of months that we've been going, that I don't have an issue, obviously, with the idea that coal is physically dirty and all of that. You only need to drive around South Africa's coal belt to see the consequences. But the environmental problem in South Africa is 20 million people who are unemployed. And the sort of moral responsibility is to do everything possible to generate the energy to make sure that those people might have jobs. Because if the country fails at that, two things happen. Firstly, you condemn them to a permanent life of the most dire, terrible poverty you can imagine. And as a consequence of that, the second point, you create a climate conducive to extremism that may come to undermine South Africa's democracy. And especially European diplomats have been absolutely terrible in South Africa in prioritizing their sort of ideological climate fixations above the welfare of millions of South Africa's people. And in as far as that's been tolerated by the South African government, I think it's a shameful thing. And we tell the story often because it's a good one, but it also says a lot. It's Gayton McKenzie, who's this new South African political figure who's been quite successful, strongly outspoken. You know, we discussed this at a point, and I said to him, you know, well, he's in the government, he's the Minister of Sport, he's close to ANC in some ways, and I said to him, you know, the next time a European diplomat tells us to turn off our power stations and further condemn millions of, in South Africa's case, black people to dire poverty, should actually escort the chap to the airport and load him on an aircraft, send him back to Brussels, and tell the Europeans they can send someone else out who actually has sufficient respect for South Africa, its history, the people, in order to realize that in our case, the right thing to do is to allow the South African government the space to take energy decisions that are in the country's best interests. And I've seen it myself. I've seen it myself. ANC politicians who say they're wary about doing what would work because the Europeans will punish us, and they will punish our exports. They will punish our economy. These are people, if you can believe it, in this age, in years after Black Lives Matter, these are people who these Europeans, they would drive black South Africans deeper into poverty in order to deal with their climate ideas. And regrettably, this remains an outpost, despite Gates's climb down, where they continue to do exactly that. Not all of them, but many of them to this very day. It's a terrible thing.
Richard?
Yeah, I just want to support everything that Frans has said, and that if there is a link between these radical environmentalists who seek to turn us back to God knows what, and those who would fundamentally oppose Western civilization. And it's capsulated in the form of Greta Thunberg, this peculiar woman who shifted seamlessly from climate activism and anti-fossil fuels to Jew hatred and everything that stands against the West. And I think it's high time that governments around the world find again their self-confidence, their civilizational self-confidence in Western values and in economic growth and the morally superior way out of poverty that is found in exploiting our natural resources like fossil fuels. It's not for nothing that one of the earliest proponents, as described by the great researcher Rupert Darwell, who's based in the UK, one of the earliest proponents of green energy and windmill power were the National Socialists in the 1930s in Germany. I guess that's where our delightful Greta gets much of her inspiration for all of her campaigns from. We must reject these things.
Simon?
No, I was just saying that Greta Thunberg is pregnant with her Somalian boyfriend, and we wish them well. It's the season of giving, so let's be generous in spirit. It's nice.
Well, thank you for that, Simon. And to take us back onto the original kind of line on the most important stories coming out of the US, I think an area that you didn't cover, which I am particularly interested in, is Charlie Kirk's death and the continuing political fallout on the right of the American political spectrum. Because it seems as though the hole that Charlie Kirk has left is trying, there are many actors who are trying to fill it, And one of the most successful actors that seems to be filling this kind of, and I'm not saying that Charlie Kirk and Nick Fuentes, who's the political actor I'm talking about, have much to do in common, but I'm saying that Nick Fuentes is trying to fill the hole that Kirk has left following his death. And that there has been an attempt to mainstream and legitimize the kind of incredibly radical messaging that people like Nick Fuentes puts forward, and also an attempt to maybe minimize the more disgusting aspects of his belief and to present him as, a little bit extreme, but he as part of the continuum of the traditional right in America, to bring him into the broad church of the right. France, you raised a hand.
Won't you just, for people who don't know, explain who Fuentes is?
Yes. So Nick Fuentes, he's been around for quite a while. When he started, he said that he used to be a kind of traditional Republican figure, and he claims that he was radicalized in university by Donald Trump, and then his engagement on university campuses and in terms of his anti-illegal immigration stance. And the response that he had to that, he claims, is what radicalized him. And now Nick Fuentes is a kind of more and more mainstream figure on the far right, who is essentially a Christian nationalist. He doesn't believe that America should be a democracy. He thinks that it should be a Catholic theocracy. He doesn't believe that America should be a cultural melting pot. He thinks that if you are to live in America, you need to be a Catholic, and preferably a white Catholic. He lays a lot of the blame of the problems in America at the feet of minorities, particularly at the feet of what he would call organized Jewry. In terms of it, just blaming the Jews for most of America's problems. And Nick Fuentes has come to the political fore this year, in the wake of Charlie Kirk's death, because people like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, who are, part of the broader right movement, but have sit on the right edge of the broader mainstream conservative movement in the United States. They have put him onto their shows, and not only put him onto their shows, but done a job of trying to whitewash his views in real time. So we'll have these commentators who sit on the political right put Nick Fuentes on, a man who talks about perfidious Jews, who has said that basically, I think I'm paraphrasing a quote, but that basically all black people should either leave the United States or be in prison, is what he believes. And they don't talk about that, but instead try to make him seem as though he is just a kind of rightward extension from the conservative movement in the United States. And I think that the thing that worries me about Nick Fuentes particularly, and we'll have talked about this more in the episode looking forward, is that Charlie Kirk has left a significant space to be occupied. And it seems as though the most successful person who is occupying that space on the right is Nick Fuentes. And if the Republicans do badly in the midterm elections, and they're looking for someone to blame and where to pivot to increase their popularity, if they see that Nick Fuentes is growing, then there is an appeal to move the politics of the right to that extreme. Let's go to Richard and then Simon.
Yeah, look, Nick Fuentes is a disgusting individual, and you point out, you raise something that is very worrying. I'm actually more worried about the direction of some of the major think tanks, like the Heritage Foundation, the ISI, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, on the right, that are not embracing directly people like Fuentes, but are abandoning a lot of the core conservative ideas that they once stood for. I'd push back a little bit on what you say that Fuentes is sort of the sort of uh, taking the space that was left by Charlie Kirk's murder. Charlie Kirk could fill stadiums with thousands of people. People would wait in line for hours to see him and to talk to him. I'm not sure that Fuentes does that. He's an online phenomenon, and we see from reporting, thanks to changes to X and reporting the Wall Street Journal, that a lot of the views he's getting are coming from bot farms in India, in Nigeria, in other countries. I think a lot of this is being driven by bot farms paid for, perhaps by bad actors who wish to see more division in the United States. I don't know how important he actually is. I think Tucker is possibly more important. He's equally on a deranged trajectory. But there again, I don't know how influential he really is. How many of the views of people hate watching him, and how many are coming from bots paid for by, let's say, Qatar or other bad actors. So I don't want to dismiss him at all. I think we should roundly condemn him, but I'm less worried about him than I am about as I said before, about the changes to the broader conservative movement. And what you see as some of these groups, like the Heritage Foundation, start abandoning their defense of free markets and free trade and things that were, staples of the conservative movement. At the same time, you see this rise on the right of anti-Semitism and identitarianism, and an embrace of victim culture. Where white men are embracing this idea that they're victims. It's kind of revolting and very un-American in its nature. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, so just on a kind of defense of what I was saying, I'm with you in that I also agree that Nick Fuentes himself is not necessarily super popular and is not going to be a Charlie Kirk in terms of his ability to fill stadiums and whatever. But I was more hinting at what you talked about, how it seems as though there's an attempt by fringe actors in the conservative movement to shift the kind of politics of conservatives in America to a much more radical, much less individualistic view of the world. To kind of, as we talked about in a much earlier episode, this rise of the woke right as a kind of mirror image of the woke left. I think that we should be fighting, for the common ground, and that's why we hope that going into the new year, you, ladies and gentlemen, tell all your friends and families about this wonderful new media platform that we've established here, and that we can continue the fight to bring common sense to South Africa and the world. And as we do that, we will pivot to the last country, and we're leaving the worst for last in terms of the United Kingdom. And so, Simon, can you take us through the kind of series of disasters that defined the UK's story of 2025?
Sure. I've got a short list, so I want to add something that I have encountered within the last 48 hours. And it's a slight counter to one of Richard's comments there, but I think you'll find it interesting. I've been watching the debate around race laws in South Africa. And on one side, you've got our friend of the show, David Ansara, and his research, and you've got the think tank and their campaign. Excuse me. And on the other side, you've got people that are saying, no, it's not happening. And then David brings his research and they go, it's not happening, but if it's happening, it's good it's happening. Or even worse than that, it's not happening, but if it's happening, it's not as bad as things that happened previously. And I don't want to really jump into this because I don't want to be a dilettante. But I've been noticing things, and I think everyone has. And one of the things that I noticed was a Bloomberg exposure of the S&P 100 that created 300,000 jobs in the wake of the George Floyd riots in 2021, 94% of whom went to people of color. Now, that's fine. Okay. That's the other thing that I've been noticing is the number of suicides particularly in the UK and in America, my end of Generation X. And I've been looking to find a way to blend all of this information and to understand the changes and so on. And I haven't found anything, and I haven't found anything. And then yesterday, I stumbled across it, and it's my recommendation for our wonderful audience. That's why I'm starting first with it, because it's a gift. And Gabriel, if you'll be so kind as to put the link in the comments. And what it is an article by a guy called Jacob Savage in Compact magazine, and it speaks about themes in hiring and recruitment practices, particularly in the media, with emphasis on America, obviously. And I think a lot of people will look at that, and they will look at the debate around race laws and not necessarily feel that they are victims, but get the feeling that there has been a campaign that has prioritized immutable characteristics. Now, I'm not interested in having an argument with a boomer about this. A guy come out and he say, "Oh, I am proud of recruiting on the basis of immutable characteristic, and I am an enlightened man," or "I am the father of a son who starred as a transsexual priest in 7 theatre productions about transsexual priests." I'm not interested in people talking about stuff like that. Okay, I think what's very important is the realities, and you'll see those in percentages of hiring practices, and they correspond to things that are not so nice. And we all have to take in this information and look at the direction of travel. And at the same time, if you're proud of running a business that is recruiting and making appointments this way, that's fine. You can do that. But you've also got to entertain the reflex. And the reflex I'm starting to see here. And I'll give you one example. I've got a friend who's a conservative politician, also a finance guy, has done incredibly well. And he's to the center right of the Conservatives, and he's stood and he has won his seats. And he tells me he's got a son of 15 years old, and his son is very right wing, but he's not radicalized by Andrew Tate on YouTube right wing. He's brooding right wing. So here's a guy who's at a private school. He can afford to be sent to Oxbridge, and he's got no interest in attending university. He wants instead to work with his hands, and this is a feeling shared amongst his friend group, and he wants to get his gas license and be a fitter. And so the things that he reads about are the congestion charges and the green taxes that are imposed upon vehicles going out to service houses. This is where this guy is. And he's coming back from the country. He's sitting in the passenger seat with his father driving, and he turns to his father. He's a quiet guy. He's a lovely chap, but his father is driving, and he turns to him and he says, "Dad, you were a member of parliament for a party that on 2 occasions voted to reduce immigration, and on both of those occasions you won the election, and then we had more immigration." And these are the types of thought processes that I'm seeing of this generation. And he's not the only one, by the way. I know other people who've commented on this. And to the guys that have enjoyed these feelings of making themselves feel better over the course of the last, especially 5 years, I think when these guys reach political maturity, it's going to be a different game. So you know what? You've done what you have, and you've made all these appointments, and a whole lot of people have been excluded on the basis of nothing else than their race. Just wait until things start shifting. So that's my gift to our wonderful audience. I'm going to send the link, and I encourage everyone to read that. The most confusing thing that happened in the UK this year was the giveaway of the Chagos archipelago to the Mauritian government. Now, the Chagos is this very important geostrategic location in the Indian Ocean, and it is home to a military base called a joint US-UK military base called Diego Garcia, and the station is capable of servicing nuclear submarines. And the United Kingdom decided, no, we're going to give it to Mauritius. So everyone's going at this point, wow, Keir Starmer is playing 4D chess. He's going to emerge with revelations about geopolitical brilliance. He's going to go to Denmark, and the Queen of Denmark is going to tap his shoulder with a sword as the most brilliant geopolitical guy ever. And we're waiting, and we can't find that. Information is not emerging. And I sent you, Gabriel, a photograph of a cover of a book that is very important in this discussion. Because
it's appearing on screen now. We just can't see it.
So this is written by a guy called Philippe Sands. Now, who is Philippe Sands? Well, he's a UK-French human rights lawyer. And in his human rights career, he was at Doughty Street Chambers, which is a progressive law firm. And who was a founding partner of Doughty Street Law Firm? It was Keir Starmer. And who was another guy at Doughty Street Chambers? It was Richard Hermer, who happens to be our Attorney General. Now, this is a power center that's less spoken about, 2/3 of which are unelected. Philippe Sands is the Mauritian negotiator. He has technically overseen this deal. And if you read the book, okay, you find little things. For example, the word B, black, is capitalized, but white people aren't afforded that same luxury. The language has been degendered in a way that a dog would be spayed. It's just taken out. So, you expect to see something like, it's not fishermen, but fisher them. And stuff like that. And then you realize, okay, why did the UK government give the Chagos Islands away? It's because people were feeling sad. People were feeling bad about themselves. And I don't know how the US guys have tolerated this so well. Maybe they were playing 4D chess and they went, well, this is such a whopping howler of a decision. We will let them stew in their own humiliation. Because on the converse side of things, if you want to talk about something that's very serious, so you've given away this geostrategic location to Mauritius. By the way, Mauritius also gets a huge whack of cash with that. So much so that the Mauritian government has decided to give its citizens a tax break. It's very nice. Okay, not people here, them. All right. And if you're looking at things that are very, very serious on the other side of that, I don't possess the geopolitical brains of my dear colleagues here, James, Frans, and Richard. I can only go on frequency, and I know when someone's trying to pull a fast one. Okay, and I've applied that same methodology to the discussion of Russia in the United Kingdom and in Europe. And I apply that methodology to Emmanuel Macron when he warns that all French hospitals have to be on a war footing by 2026. The military will be making inspections from February. I can't tell you with any certainty that he's lying. Then I apply it to Mark Rutte, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands and the current head of NATO. He makes a statement last week about how Russia is, we must be prepared to fight Russia. He's not lying either. Yesterday, in the morning, the new head of MI6 is a woman. Her name is Blaise Metriweli. Her grandfather was a Nazi collaborator. I'm not sure if they researched that properly, but at least Parliament didn't give the guy a standing ovation like the Canadians did. But she's standing in front of the camera and she's going, well, Russia is playing games with us and we're going to start to respond. And, maybe it's about time, because there have been a couple of chemical attacks on Russian soil and there have been all sorts of other cyber hacks and so on. But no sooner has she finished speaking when the head of the UK Armed Forces stands up, Sir Richard Kingston, and he says exactly the same thing. In one day, you've got two major fixtures within the national security apparatus warning this country that, well, the last time that this sort of thing happened on the same day, the country was at war. Okay? It's a long, long time ago. So please, let me bring that back to the esteemed panel and help me answer the question of why the UK gave away the Chagos Islands at this precarious stage, because I simply cannot accept that it was feeling sad or bad about it. Does anyone have anything to add there? Okay, we'll save that for later. That's fine. Okay. The next item, which I
Are you just hang on? Let's just go to Chagos again. Are you are you suggesting that there was ulterior ideas around threatening Chagos, or was it just as I understood it? Maybe you think I'm naive, that the Starmer government wanted to make a big statement about how it felt about the idea of colonial possessions. Not that Chago actually was not a colonial possession. Oh, it wasn't nothing to do with Mauritius at all. I mean, they have no tie to it historically in the deep history. I just understood it to be a sort of statement of virtue signaling that just happened to have catastrophic national security implications for the West. Are you saying there was something else?
No, I'm saying I'm still confused. I'm sure that is probably the reason, but the reasons that have been given today about a couple of people returning home, especially as they featured in that book that Philippe Sands wrote, is things that I just struggle to realize, because there's a lot worse that's happened, and with a lot less of a response required than this, and taken into consideration that we're looking at a very serious time period ahead of us. So okay, that's great. Moving
Just one
on
second, Simon.
Yeah.
James, you raised a hand.
No, it's not really a comment. It's just it's sort of, you get the same feeling that you used to get in South Africa when something very strange happened, like you suddenly purchased huge amounts of weaponry for no good reason at excessive prices, or Jacob Zuma suddenly puts in Des Van Rooyen into the finance ministry. You do get a sense that you don't know actually what's really going on here, but what it is, I can't say.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, and that's the feeling that I'd leave you guys with. I'd probably be more aligned to France's virtue signaling, but who knows? It's just very confusing, and that's why I think it's the most confusing thing that I think this country has experienced in a year.
Let's go just quickly back to France.
And on Russia, maybe if Europe doesn't want a war with Russia, it should review the assurances it offered the Russians after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that it wouldn't move aggressively on Russia through the eastward expansion of NATO. I mean, that's where I think a lot of the current trouble has arisen from, and that in fact the rather than saber rattling, which is what this Western stuff sounded like to me, and I'm happy to be in the minority, the Western strategy on Russia should be to turn it into a bulwark, just from a European perspective, between Europe and China. I mean, what do you say to that?
Yeah, I would argue that Russia isn't exactly outperforming. They struggled to take they tried Kyiv, it hasn't worked, and they're struggling with these little villages around Donbass. So I think the threat is there, but not to the extent that they imagine it, and not to the extent that people have received it in the last 24 hours. We're talking about people that are literally going to the store and stocking up because they're worried. It's like another permanent emergency, like they're lockdowns. But to your point is a review of the post-Cold. I think that's exactly right. If you want to avoid something, then that's a obvious starting point. But maybe France, they don't want to avoid it. Maybe there is something in these societies where they are rapidly losing faith in politics. You want to see the numbers of young people that are prepared to go into fight for Britain in the event of a Russian continent conflict. It's less than 20%. I think it's even less than 15% at a YouGov poll that was conducted 6 months ago. And these things require national interest, and there are a lot of people that feel that there are more pressing issues at home, certainly in the UK, than going to die in a Russian winter. But yeah.
So Frans, do you have another comment there?
Yeah, we'll pick this up in 2026. I think.
That
think so
sounds
too.
that sounds good. So
Right, Gabriel, back to you.
So, Simon, let's go continue on to the rest of the UK's outlook. What the other stories? So we've had the Chagos Islands and Russia, and now tell us about what's happening
Well, I
at
think
home,
a
maybe.
very worrying trend in UK politics is also a very worrying trend in other countries, which is the emerging alliance between the Islamist guys and the left guys, the Islamo Left Alliance. And Tony Blair has warned on this previously, but you can see it perfectly captured in the Green Party that has emerged and is doing incredibly well in the polls. But I take you to Sunday in the pogrom at Bondi Beach as an example of where things are. We're 2 days out of that. It's been memory hold already. All of the emphasis is on the guy who helped save some people in the attack, or disarmed one of the attackers and got shot himself. And congratulations to that gentleman. He seems like remarkably courageous. But if you look at the attention where we are, it's that. And then you can go back a few months back to see the statements of the Premier of New South Wales, Chris Mims, in which he declared that he had forsaken free speech for multiculturalism. And then again, you look at the consequences of Sunday, and everyone's talking like the meme that the late comedian Norm Macdonald made. And I'm not sure if you know what I'm referring to, but it's imagine the backlash against peaceful Muslims. And I'm sorry to tell you, but I feel that there's a level of tolerance that's being applied here, and that's kind of also related to the grooming gangs in the UK and the lack of prosecutions and the lack of investigations and the cover-ups that have already occurred. And I think that's something to watch for the future, because in my estimation, and another thing that's happened this morning is that we've gone 2 days. There was Sunday night in Sydney. We've gone 2 days, and the British Parliament says that it's close to nearing a definition of Islamophobia. These are not the sort of things that people want to hear at this stage. It's irrelevant almost. So I'm worried about that as a future theme. And then I'm worried about, alongside that, is obviously the economics. We spent a lot of time this year on this show talking about the borrowing costs, talking about the productivity decline, the flatlining economy, the growth. We've been talking about the cratering jobs market. And I went into some detail to explain the absolute disaster of the budget, the latest budget. And sometimes the most simplest explanations, I kind of putting things together to understand why there is such a cock-up at the moment in the Treasury and why everything is being so badly received. And then you go back to a week before and the Times only reported this recently, but a week before the budget was announced, Rachel Reeves has her crack squad of whatever they are, economics people, and one of them is Baroness Manoush Shafiq, who was previously the president of Columbia University. And all of these people are going to solve all of the problems, and the bond vigilantes are going to be kept at bay. And what emerged from that specific summit was one profile who held court. And his name is Torsten Bell, and he's the Labour MP for Swansea. And if you look at these guys, he's the child of a Swedish academic. And he comes from a very specific way of seeing things. And I am of the view now that it isn't just financial illiteracy that is prevailing within the Treasury, and why this eruption happened with the Office for Budget Responsibility, and why Andrew Bailey is still the governor of the Bank of England when he falls asleep during meetings. And it's because there's a power struggle. And this goes to a point that Frans made previously, is that you probably are looking at a time where politicians feel that they have a better chance than ever of running the economy to their preferences and without consideration for market forces. And so he's a guy, if he is now the power center within the treasury, I think that's something to look out for in the coming years. And it's like Russia, we'll probably revisit this in 2026, certainly if it continues its decline. And then just on a note about, I've got I'm coming to the end of 10 years, a decade in this place, which I've loved, and obviously a place is made by its people. But I've noticed in that decade, just everywhere I look, and these are professional relationships, these are sentiments in the media, these are editorial policies, there's been a giant shift in people's patience. And I look at these forces that have occupied British politics for the last 10 years. It's been the site of two major political events. You had the Brexit in 2016, then you had the world event and Britain leading the way in lockdowns, and then you've opened the door through various, the fixture of the Uni Party, where you vote but nothing changes really, has worn away at a very open-minded people's patience. And I think we've referenced it before. There are signs that society is in trouble and that these two forces are coming together in a way that could be potential conflict. That is certainly the thesis of one of London's most respected military historians and the professor of war at the King's College London. The criteria for unrest have been met. But I don't want to see that, because I love this place and the people have made it. I came here with very little. I didn't know anyone. And I've had a wonderful, wonderful time. And I leave slightly worried about that particular element and where that's going. And I'm hoping that we won't have to discuss it next year, because maybe this is all a giant misunderstanding, and that maybe in people's dreams, the fixture of Russia will form this item of national interest and everyone will galvanize in solidarity, and they won't worry about their neighbors, and they won't worry about these forces that are on them, and certainly they will start overlooking the financial implications of policies that is just not designed to suit them in the form of taxes and so on. But that is what I leave it. And I want to mention just someone quickly. I'm not sure if any of you ever followed the New Culture Forum, but it was started by a very dear friend of mine, Peter Whittle. Peter very sadly died 2.5 weeks ago. He had a very aggressive cancer. But I think the way that he formed a kind of a logical resistance by encouraging debate and by tackling issues that others were afraid to, and grew this huge organic following across the country. When I've been to many events, that's the way that you fight battles. And I think he left the world and can be very proud of the work that he's done in illuminating so much of what's wrong with politics, but also suggesting better alternatives. And that's that, Gabriel. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you so much, Simon. To you, James?
Yeah, just a sort of additional point in response to Simon and Richard is, people have, I mean, obviously in the West, I think, legitimate grievances, and the West is facing serious threats as well. And I'd be very careful of these sort of Pied Piper figures that sort of suddenly pop up. And you see it in the UK with the Greens. And their agendas actually would, if implemented, make things considerably worse for people. And obviously, and in the US, someone like Nick Fuentes on the right, he's also has that vibe about him. This is someone who sort of wants to sort of mix in legitimate legitimate grievances of many young men, but then he mixes it in with all sorts of noxious kind of deeply noxious kind of ideas. And the effect of that is to actually sort of discredit the cause, isolate those young men, and actually put them into a worse position than they would before. So I think one must be careful of those people, just not just on their own terms, but also look at whose agenda they actually are advancing, and be very careful of them.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice. This recently the former head of the Venezuelan military intelligence has issued a statement. He's in prison in the United States, setting out on his telling of it, how Venezuela was part, and the drug smuggling was in fact part of a much broader strategy to seek to weaken the United States. And this wasn't just commercial drug dealing. Obviously, it had that angle to it, and there were other aspects to it. And he links that to a whole lot of actors who are hostile to the Western world generally. And even on SA, we can talk about this a bit next year. We've in the past have reason to suspect that some of the country's extreme white right were actually civil servants. Who were in the employ of the state. And I don't think there should be much. A very good way to approach a figure like a Fuentes, so mad, so hateful, so divisive, is to consider that this would be a very effective means for an external actor to sow division and social discord and internal hate within the West, which is such an important thing to do, should you wish to weaken its relative competitiveness. And so that's one point. Another point, Simon, we're a bit over time perhaps, but I'll call on the UK. I mean, you're leaving now. You're going to California after your 10 years, but our call on the UK remains that you can go long on it. Because we think, if we still do, we think that the consequence of this kind of economic and fiscal illiteracy you saw in this recent budget will later be to trigger a series of political events that may will see the UK, let's just make a call, will see the UK, let's say a decade out from now, positioned as a much more competitive destination. So do you still, as you leave, do you still hold that view?
Of course, and I think I articulated to the point last week, and I can only trust people like Jamie Dimon and Steve Schwartzman because of their ability to live in the future. And their forecasts are made on a series of assumptions. And those assumptions include a wholesale change to things like migration policy, remigration included in that, but as well as the dependency people have on welfare. And those are big assumptions, Frans. I think that is going to be a very difficult thing for people to swallow, and there may be sparks. But on the long term, I do agree with you. In 10 years' time, this place could be vastly different, and that puts the pressure on someone like Nigel Farage, who, on the resistance, call it the resistance, that's sort of meeting and edging closer to this new way of seeing the world as espoused by likes of Keir Starmer and Philippe Sands. You have a political representation at the one side, but it's only half of that. People underestimate the size of the despondency, the volume of it here, and a lot of people don't feel that Nigel Farage has the minerals to accomplish what needs to happen, which I think is a good thing, because it creates that level of firstly pressure, and then concessions and trade-offs. which is more the language that these people speak, as opposed to what is happening now, certainly on the economy side. So I do agree with you.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for all of your contributions. That feels like a great place to leave it. And if 2025 has taught us anything, it is that the pendulum in politics will keep swinging. So we turn, this will be the last episode of this year. We won't have another episode out next week, but join us again the week after that for the first episode of 2026 to make sure that you stay up to date on all of the most important stories coming out of South Africa and the world. Simon, you want to get in just before, as I'm closing here?
No, just to say, to wish our audience a very Merry Christmas, and thank you for all the support and more people about it.
Yeah.
Yes, that's perfect. So, Merry Christmas to all of the viewers at home. Merry Christmas to our wonderful panel, and we will see you again in the new year. I've been Gabriel Makin, and this has been Makin Sense.